السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الآن سنبدأ الندوة الثالثة أو الجلسة الثالثة في ندوتنا عن تجارب الحركات الإسلامية في السياسة والحكم، وهذه الندوة مخصصة لتجربة الإخوان.
The symposium is dedicated to the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Today, this morning, we have our second session. Now we're going to start with the third session about lessons learned and future outlook. Originally, we had three speakers. However, unfortunately, Dr. Abdel Mawjoud al-Dardiri is not feeling well and he's been taken to the hospital. We pray that he gets well soon, but we still have two speakers. The first paper is entitled 360 Days in Power, Lessons Learned from the Muslim Brotherhood in Governance in Egypt. This paper is going to be presented by Mr. Abdurrahman Hussam, who is finalizing his PhD thesis, and he is a scholar who used to work in Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul, where he is working on his PhD, as I mentioned, in political theories and civilizational studies. He worked and cooperated with many studies centers and think tanks in the Middle East and Europe. He has an MA in political science from Istanbul Shahir University with his dissertation on the Egyptian army since Napoleon to 2018, and it's called a genealogy, and he published his first book on the challenges of the Muslim Brotherhood in 2011, and he has many publications and papers in academic journals and books, a very long list of publications. If you'd like to learn more about him, you will find an elaborated biography of all of our speakers and commentators. This paper is going to be followed by the ascent to the Abbas. It will be presented by Mr. Ahmed Mohsin, who is working on his PhD in the final stages of his PhD in Zaim University in political studies and international relations department. He has an MA on public studies from Doha, and he also established the Institute for Public Policy and Good Governance. He also worked in the Egyptian Institute for Studies between 2019 to 2020. He has a number of papers and refereed publications, including papers on governance and health institutions and the role of the Egyptian army. After these two papers, we are going to have two commentators. The first is Mr. Rida Fahmi, who is a parliamentarian and the head of the former head of National Security Department in the Parliament. The Egyptian Parliament. He has also a master's degree in political science from Cairo University, and he has many publications on the Arab-Israeli conflict and about many issues in the Middle East, and he has contributions to many events and symposia in Asia, Europe, and the MENA region. Also, he will be followed by the second commentator, Mr. Muhammad Ilhami, who is an Egyptian scholar and researcher in Islamic history and civilization. He is also a holder of MA in Islamic economics. He also works on his PhD in Islamic history, and he has many publications and studies published in Arab journals, and he monitored and supervised Kalimat Haq publication. We lost. Oops.
صوت يا دكتور عفوا. صوت يا دكتور. السلام عليكم.
يبدو أن هناك مشكلة في الصوت.
السلام عليكم.
عبد الرحمن حسام فليتفضل.
I give the floor now to Mr. Abdurrahman Hussam. Please go ahead.
السلام عليكم مساء أو صباح الخير عليكم، وبشكر دكتور سامي العريان والمركز على دعوتي.
I would like to thank Dr. Sami Al-Aryan and SIGA for inviting me.
بشكر دكتور سامي العريان والمركز والمؤسسات المتعاونة مع المركز على دعوتي لهذا المؤتمر، وبشكر حضراتكم على الحضور.
I thank SIGA and could you please mute your microphones? People who are joining us online, could you please mute your microphones? Okay, now that we have the slides on, I'd like to welcome you again. My paper is entitled 365 Days in Power, 7 Lessons Learned from the Experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in Governance. On the 30th of June 2011, Mohamed Morsi took the oath as the Egyptian president, the first civilian elected president in the history of Egypt, but also the first president from the Muslim Brotherhood. So after the Muslim Brotherhood was in the shadows for decades, it took the leadership, but this victory did not last for long, and it faced a lot of trouble, which may have been the worst in its history, although there were a number of subjective and objective factors that played into this failure. But the main reasons were from within. And in the context of studying the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood, this study used an analytical historical approach to answer a question: how can a political actor in the context of a democratic revolutionary transformation work successfully?
There are 7 lessons that we can take. First, we need to understand the historic moment and what it requires. And to redefine in accordance with it, which means that we need to understand the political realities and not to surrender, and then to correct our mistakes before it is too late. 4, we need to meet our promises. 5, we must not take any risk that is out of our capacity without being prepared. We need to analyze and to gain the friendship of the former regime and other politicians. Finally, we should not only win transform this winning that is effective and sustainable. So we will start with the first lesson of understanding and being aware of the political moment. First, the group was. It seems that we lost the speaker source. Even when the group joined the revolution and took it on its shoulders. The Muslim Brotherhood were looking to gains, and that was in the meeting of Omar Suleiman, whereas the revolution was in the squares. Then the Muslim Brotherhood were unable to build a common project for change and to bridge the gaps with those who are different from them ideologically and politically. On the contrary, the Muslim Brotherhood tried to be opportunistic and to gain the political sphere in Egypt through elections. Also, the revolutionist moment requires you to be fast in order to reconstruct or restructure the state institutions, especially the bureaucracy, the military, education, the judiciary, and the media. But the Muslim Brotherhood tried to maintain these state institutions to employ them for their benefit. Also, the revolution requires you to build one unified revolutionist front with all other groups, especially the secular ones, to face the military council and the army who removed Mubarak in order to control the country. But on the contrary, the decision of the Muslim Brotherhood or the strategic decision was to make alignment with the military in order to take piece of the cake in Egypt. Five, the Muslim Brotherhood thought that the control is in the deepest state, so they wanted to undermine the force of the revolutionist forces and the youth, and that's why they were against the Muslim Brotherhood. And when through the making alliance with the military establishment, they thought that if they make concessions to the deep state and to the military, it will promote their political interest on the long run. They didn't know that making alliance with the establishment and making enmity with the youth, it will keep them uncovered in the face of the military, and the military is going to use that later. The Muslim Brotherhood were really skilled in making enemies and losing friends and allies. The revolution also requires to re-identify yourself and to rebuild your structures and ideology based on the new era. The Muslim Brotherhood were unable to reintroduce themselves and redefine themselves after the revolution of January 2011. The nature of the structures of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the solid hierarchy, was unable to interact quickly with the new forces in the sphere, and they were unable to revisit their reformist approach or to make any changes or breakthroughs in their political grounds. The second lesson, which is to go beyond the reality and be aware of the illusions. The Muslim Brotherhoods were unable to be aware of what was happening in the political arena, and they couldn't see the changes that were happening. So they went through different mistakes or making several mistakes, and they thought that the military indeed is going to make alliances with them. They didn't give a priority for putting the military establishment under the control of a civilian authority. So the Muslim Brotherhood wanted to make alliance with the military establishment to make political gains for themselves, and they didn't limit the role of the military establishment in political life. Only they did that when they wanted to devoid the decisions or the resolutions of the president. The military, so after the toppling of Mubarak, they maintained the gains of the military establishment after in the constitution of 2013. And through the alliance that the military establishment, through the temporary alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood, they thought that those Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic movements can mobilize the streets with them. So this implied is the alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood will prevent them from making any alliances with other youth groups and the secular groups. By doing so, they will make the Muslim Brotherhoods isolated from others. years, the military establishment started to make a coup against the Muslim Brotherhood after August in 2013, which included above constitutional principles, which gave the military wide powers apart from the political sphere. So the Muslim Brotherhood or the people went to the Muslim Brotherhood addressed the people, and they said that the events of 1954 are well known to you. Then in June 2011, they moved, and the Constitutional Court dismantled the or dissolve the elected parliament, and the Muslim Brotherhood didn't see that this was a coup against their electoral gains and against the revolution, and they didn't go to make alliance with other youth groups and the other forces in the revolution to protect them. The third point, which is quickly correct the mistakes. The Muslim Brotherhood thought that if they can work with the military through making alliance with them, but the military establishment managed to kill the revolution, and the Muslim and the military established after another. Muslim Brotherhood was destroyed, and they were isolated from the grassroots, and that was the road to diminish the credibility of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the military establishment started to make a coup, and the Muslim Brotherhood didn't correct their mistakes, and they didn't mend fences with the other groups, especially the secular ones, they and then Morsi issued the constitutional declaration, which complemented the constitution. The lessons that we learned from that: in the beginning of the revolution, the Muslim Brotherhoods were speaking about the joint work with other political parties, and that they don't want to control the new political landscape. However, all of that were only claims, and it has nothing to do with their practices on the ground. The Muslim Brotherhood betrayed their promises that they are going to use democracy for everyone, and that they will not compete for over not going to have a candidate. The justifications of the Muslim Brotherhood were very shallow, and they used the democratic institutions of the country to make gains for themselves using the institutions of the state. However, their performance led to the opposition, led to the opposite of that. So instead, so their alliance with the establishment led them to be isolated from making making alliances with the other forces, and they made enmities with them. And now, in terms of the Fairmont Morsi, before the recount, the other round of the presidential election, agreed on 6 months the military council. However, after Morsi succeeded, it was very crucial to ensure the success of the Morsi in the second round of the elections. After the success of Morsi, all of these agreements were made void. Then, not the fifth lesson is not to get into a risk or a journey without being the rule was very difficult. So the Muslim Brotherhood gave the military an important or a golden opportunity opportunity to put obstacles in getting into the ruling. The Muslim any skill to run the country. And Egypt, since its establishment until the elections of Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood were in opposition in general. Then getting into the presidency, it should have had improvement of the mentality, from the mentality of an organization to the mentality of a state, because the earlier is limited, whereas the later should be open and expand, and they should understand that they went from opposition to a ruling party. Part of that is because of the limited people or few people who can make the internal decisions of this larger group, and that the decision making process within the group is secret and very ambiguous. And well, here I have another important point, which is the control of the few number of people and their control of the decision making, and the control of one person on these few people having this organizational control and the structure made the group go into the direction of achieving the goals of the control of that person. After the freedom and justice party was established and Morsi became in the as a president, it was very important to make sure of how these things are, or these decisions are being made. Fifth, the lack of the strategic thinking within the group, especially with the drain of the powers or of uh, the social or the elements, the youth elements from them. Then we had the group became an uh, an environment that is not welcoming to for the capable and the qualified people. And here I will give the example of Mr. Al Katatni, and this made the group less flexible to interact with the deep social changes that were happening in the country, especially that the youth were the spearhead in the group and the front line in so many things that happen. The sixth lesson, which is limiting some sectors in the old regime. First, not only the military was against the Muslim Brotherhood, there were other sectors against the Muslim Brotherhood, including the judiciary and the security forces. If who didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood, if they were not also showing enmity against them. Some of these groups were happy that Mubarak was not in power anymore, but those groups in the security were in enmity with the Muslim Brotherhoods by the nature of its presence and its establishment. And when they got into power, they started to show alarming signs. There were also other sectors within the state looking at the Muslim Brotherhoods that they are backwarded and they cannot function in this era. And those sectors didn't accept the policies of the Muslim Brotherhood because they threaten their interests. So they planned and plotted to foil the Muslim Brotherhood, regardless whether the Muslim Brotherhood noticed that or not. But those sectors were acting together against the Muslim Brotherhood, and those they were acting and making alliances with the deep state within Egypt. The last lesson: building a political, an effective and sustainable political ground. The Muslim Brotherhood didn't put any trust in the elections, and on the contrary, they didn't they were unable to provide an inclusive discourse, and they moved from a good space into a popular position. Then Mursi's understanding or notion of elections, he understood that it is, if they win the elections, it means that they will have the decision to make or they will have the power to make decisions on all of the points. That's why the Muslim Brotherhood's mentality was based on coercion, not on participation, against what they promised before the elections. Then the Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood were unable to make this failure in elections into making a broad grassroots for them to have a wide a group with the different cultural and religious backgrounds without any discrimination. And that's because of the lack of ability of Morsi to represent the diversity of the Egyptian people in within the state of the state institutions. And the Muslim Brotherhood's categorization was sectarian and discriminatory. Finally, we can have, I will repeat the 7 lessons that we can learn from the failure of the Muslim Brotherhoods in governance in answering the question, how can you successfully rule in a democratic revolutionist transformation? First, you have to be aware of the historic moment and the requirements of that moment. You have to be aware of the political game and do not surrender to your illusions, correcting the uh, the third point, you have to correct your mistakes quickly before it is too late. 4, you have to meet your the previous pledges and promises. 5, you have not to take any risk journey without being prepared. 6, you have to eliminate or gain the friendship of all of sectors within the old regime. And 7, you have to build a political grassroots, not only to win the elections. You have to make that winning a political, effective and sustainable ground for you. Finally, we have the one important question, which is why the Muslim Brotherhoods made all of these grave mistakes one after another, because it is really surprising that in all of the positions and all in the junctures, the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood were taking the worst decisions until they lost themselves and wasted the revolution with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abdurrahman, in this very rich paper. You talked at the beginning to the ascent of the Muslim Brotherhood to go to power, and he used a historical analytical approach in analyzing the reasons of failure for the Muslim Brotherhood from within. He talked about 7 lessons learned, which is understanding the historical point and failure to restructure the institutions and to build an alliance of a revolution in making allies and creating a revolution, a subjective within revolution, and also what he called a sort of exploitation of partners within the revolution, mainly because of the long-term interests of the group, and in order to appease the deep state. The second point was overcoming illusions, and that there were many problematic stances in the alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood with the army, and in eliminating the revolution for political gain, and for example, in ensuring the economic interest of the army in the constitution. The third was a quick addressing or a correction of path and learning lessons which undermined their credibility. The fourth lesson was to uphold the previous pledges and promises, so they did not They tried to justify their options. He talked about the Vermont agreements and the pledges made in relation to the presidency election, to taking monopoly of political power. The fifth, was that they undertook a challenge that was beyond their own capacity, such as the presidency, the lack of bureaucratic experience, failure to change the mentality from one of an organization or a movement to that of a state. And so there were some powerful points figures in the group or in the movement that used the power of the movement for their own gain, and that it was repulsive for qualified persons. The sixth lesson was trying to appease people in the old state, and the negligence of people who used to be in the previous state but who would have been assets for the new state. The seventh is the failure to create a sustainable base and foundation, and that their effort was faulty, and their understanding of democracy was faulty, focused mainly on the elections and on the monopoly of power rather than partnership, which made them fail in upholding that responsibility. So they were unable to effect diversity in the government institutions, and in addition to their discourse, which he said were exclusive, partisan, and sectarian. So those lessons that they should overcome illusions, correct their mistakes, uphold their promises. We lost the sound. I can't hear Dr. Sami. You have a problem with the microphone, probably. Okay, please go ahead. Thank you, Dr. Sami. I am really very happy to have been invited to this conference. Very often I was one of the attendees in various conferences organized by SIGA, whether on military civilian relations, secularism, and now I'm really thrilled that it's time for me to share my views with my colleagues. So I thank SIGA and all organizers of this event. In today's paper, I hope you can see my screen right now. I have shared my screen. This paper is based on a problem or a phenomenon that many people were surprised with, that in 2011, before the January revolution, if we look at political analyses at the time, months before the revolution, we were talking about two main political actors with the future outlook or future power in affecting the future of Egypt. The first was the military institution, the second was the Muslim Brotherhood. So in 2011, for political observers, the ascent of Muslim Brotherhood was nothing surprising, looking at the outlook in previous years, especially between 2004 and 2010. But what was surprising was why the Muslim Brotherhood did not manage to hold on to power and maintain power for a long time. Some people attributed this to external factors such as regional factors and lack of regional backers to democratic transformation, and others referred to the existing political elites who failed to create meaningful alliances, and others focused on the role of the military institution, which was keen on failing and discontinuing that experience. And those three factors are indeed important and should not be disregarded. But what we are focusing on in this paper are the factors related to the movement itself, to the Muslim Brotherhood, without playing down the other factors. But I'm focusing here on the factors that the movement could have controlled in a way that could have improved or come with an outcome that was different from what we saw. So the paper studies the situation of the Muslim Brotherhood mainly as a case study for the political movements that try to manage political change during democratic transformation, and it tries to look for a political project that is clear. So, and that any political movements that do not have a clear political project and to try to manage democratic transformation, the absence of such a project make them fail and stumble in trying to manage political change and democratic transformation. So I tried in my methodology, I was part actually of those events very often. So in order to maintain objectivity, I tried to depend on secondary resources written by foreign scholars and researchers, mostly academic papers or PhD theses, in addition to field studies and interviews that I tried to collect. The first of those factors, which we can observe even before 2011, it was the approach to politics from a political da'wah, a position from an opposition position, instead of being the one in power. So the Muslim Brotherhood used the political da'wah, as mentioned by Samir Shahada in one of his writings. He said the idea is to take part in elections in semi-authoritarian regimes, so that you want to take seats in a certain parliament, but your main goal is not to reach power or to govern, but to reach more influence in for your organization in the community in order to effect more social and political change. So it tries to influence the community, but its main goal from participating in public and political life is not to reach power, but or to manage the public policy or the state in a different approach. So practicing politics from that perspective makes it the case that you don't actually have, you don't focus on having a political project. Your focus is on reaching out to the largest number of people possible, talk to them about your own project, regardless of power, regardless of the state. So in this stage, at this stage, the preference was to practice politics from the position of opposition. The difference here is that when you are in the opposition, your focus would be on the criticism of the governmental policies rather than trying to offer alternative policies. So if we look at the economic policies, we would find that in the 50s and 60s, the Muslim Brotherhood, some of its leaderships tried to focus on socialist Islam, and they looked at it from a positive perspective, or positively. But when Sadat came to power, many of the leaders adapted to the open market policies, and part of them adopted those because they were against the Nasserite era, and some of them because they themselves were businessmen or allied with some businessmen who would benefit from those policies. So basically, the changes in the vision of the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of economic perspective was not based on a cohesive vision as much as it was because they were in the position of opposition that tries to criticize the status quo. So this was the first point. The second is that the Muslim Brotherhood movement had a history of deferred internal conflict. So before 2011, this Muslim Brotherhood movement was regarded as a cohesive body that can manage its internal conflicts properly. But apart from that external image, from the inside, the political project, if we talk in political terms, you would find a different perspective. What's the position of the movement from the economic model? How can you deal with the industrial, agricultural policies, etc.? You would find discrepancies. If the movement have offered answers to this earlier in its history, it would have caused some division, and that's why it deferred those answers and tried to work on creating a cohesive image. And this was also enhanced by the fact that there was no cohesive ideology. So before the January Revolution, the organizational cohesion was tantamount with incohesive ideology, and economically the declared discourse was against the market economy before 2011. But after the January Revolution, we would find two parallel attitudes in the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood. The first were people who abided by their pre-2011 view, who opposed the neoliberal policies, while another line was clear, held by Dr. Muhammad Mursi, as well as many young leaders, as reflected in practice on the ground. If we go back, for example, to Hassan Majdi, when he talks about economics, we will find that the views expressed were so diverse. What happened is that the Muslim Brotherhood ignored answers to very essential questions in order to maintain the cohesion of the movement itself. So why did they change after 2011? You have come to power and you're supposed to offer more detailed and elaborate answers. And why did we have those discrepancies in which some of the rank and file of the Muslim Brotherhood were inclined to neoliberal policies? I believe the main reasons or the interpretation for this was the so-called Muslim Brotherhood pragmatism, which is the presence of more than one interpretation for their own texts. So because you have a range of or a margin for maneuver. The other reason was the elite, the businessman elite, which existed within the Muslim Brotherhood, and it was in the interest of the Muslim Brotherhood to maintain their relations with them, and they became the source of income for the Muslim Brotherhood, and they started to express more freely their points of view, which were sometimes different from the mainstream in the Muslim Brotherhood. The third reason is international recognition. So when I talk about the market economy and neoliberalism, some people in the Muslim Brotherhood regarded that as an easy way to get international recognition on how we are going to address issues related to economy and the global neoliberal policies. So it was that international recognition concern that was behind this partly. At any rate, so the movement deferred answers to essential questions and deferred taking positions from critical issues in Egypt in order to maintain cohesion. For example, the project of Al-Nahda or the Renaissance, which may be a good example. If we look at it, in actuality, it was originally, it wasn't a political project, and it started before 2011. It was a civilizational, so to speak, or developmental vision developed before 2011. When we had the decisive moment in 2011, and we had to go into the elections and have our own program, and Nahda project was a quick reaction, incomplete reaction, in reaction to the emerging external pressure or the circumstances. So regardless of whether it was completely adopted or complete as a project, it was put forward. So this was one of the explanations and one of the factors. The third was the overlap in leadership. So even when we have the Mohamed Morsi as the first elected president of Egypt, supposedly this should have helped to quicken or accelerate the answers to urgent questions. But the problem was the overlap in leadership. And here, actually, I hate to talk about the relation between Mohamed Morsi and Khaled al-Shater from a personal perspective, but I'd like to inspect it from a structural point of view. So now we had a president. Let's look from the side of Khaled al-Shater. He was the strongest figure in the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is the movement that made Mohamed Morsi reach to power. So practically, if we look from a power politics point of view, supposedly this should be the strongest man in the movement, and he should be the nominee for and the president-elect on behalf of the movement for presidency. But that didn't happen. We had another person who is Mohamed Morsi, and Mohamed Morsi would not have reached the presidency without the support of the Muslim Brotherhood. So very naturally, in any country, he would try to continue to have their backing and to appease them. But at the same time, he had another problem, is that he remained all the time trying to appease the Muslim Brotherhood without building relations and networking with others. He would lose on other grounds. So he tried to strike a balance and say that he was a president for all Egyptians, not only for the Muslim Brotherhood, but in the meanwhile, this reflected negatively or resounded negatively with the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, that they brought him to power and then he is not abiding by the view of the movement. So it was ultimately a structural problem. The person who came to power was not actually the strongest figure in the movement, so he did not have enough power and influence to make decisions, implement them, and see them through. And at the same time, if the movement was no longer confident that Muhammad Mursi would approve its own suggestions, so this structural problem caused stumbling in the approach of the Muslim Brotherhood and lack of cohesion therein. The fourth factor in my paper was in post 2013 point, where we have this point where we had a coup d'etat, and the Muslim Brotherhood movement was under unprecedented crackdown. Here we find that those deferred disagreements came to the forefront. Many regarded them as differences in terms of management, regulation, etc. But some others saw that it was about violence or non-violence approaches. But ultimately, those disagreements were at heart political, because up to that point, the reaction to the coup d'etat was unclear. If we have this much diversity in the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood itself, and we have no clear structure anymore, so those who take the lead would only define this position. So I regard those disagreements during that time not only as administrative disagreements, nor as disagreements in terms of the approach, violent or non-violent, but they were ultimately political disagreements about where this movement should go and who should lead and make decisions. So since 2014 until the end of 2015, we could say that this was the last period during which the movement was active. It was the time in which the movement was able to effect everything it tried to do for decades by trying to stop or be discreet and not show its internal disagreements to the public. It was all undone. To conclude, my conclusions may require a lot of discussion, but this is what I have come up with from my reading and my understanding. The political roles for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was part of history and shall not be part of our Egyptian future. In other words, the political roles it played in the past were quite influential, and they took a role in very decisive moments in Egyptian history, but given the present conditions, it's very hard to imagine they would continue to be part of the Egyptian future. Even if the movement would reconcile with the regime, so its final political act would be to declare that it would no longer practice politics. Why have I come with that conclusion? Actually, because political roles will not be available for the Muslim Brotherhood, not only because of the external factors, but also because of internal factors within the Muslim Brotherhood movement, because of the discrepancy in vision and outlook that can no longer coexist under the same umbrella. So this is one of the factors, and also at the same time, if there is no clear, well-defined political project, the movement will not persist in political terms. Does that mean that it's not going to continue in dawah terms, in societal terms, in charity terms? Maybe, but as a political actor, I don't believe it's going to persist. And another point is that there is also a transition now from grand questions to smaller questions, to more detailed questions. And this is different from the approach adopted by the movement for a long history. An important point here, if we say that there is no political future for the movement, does that mean there is no political future for its members? Actually, no. On the contrary, its members are going to probably have a political future, but through different manifestations and organizations from the Muslim Brotherhood with different varying political visions, and this discrepancy is going to be so wide that we will find answers offered by former figures of the Muslim Brotherhood that are from the far right to the far left, although they used to belong to the same movement. Why? Because the political nature of those questions inform those answers. What is the magic word? The magic word is capacity, capability to produce and generate that political project that will gather honest and powerful figures and members of the movement. It is those who have that capability who are going to conjure that political influence in the future. That was the summary of my paper. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed, for this presentation. Actually, it was also very rich in questions that are up for discussion. The main question that Mr. Ahmed posed was why Muslim Brotherhood failed in political transformation in Egypt, and he said that there were two main political actors in the Egyptian arena historically and objectively during the revolution, who were the Muslim Brotherhood and the military institution. The ascent of the Muslim Brotherhood was not surprising, but the surprising was an inability to persist. Although there were some reasons related to external factors, the military institution or external forces or international forces, but he said that the paper he presented would only focus on internal factors without disregarding the external factors, i.e. he would focus on the factors that could have been controlled and improved by the movement itself. And in this approach, he tried to answer why those movements would fail during democratization or democratic transformation. The main reason is the lack of a clear political project. His method for research was to depend on secondary sources by papers and research and observation more than field work within the institutions of the Muslim Brotherhood. The other thing, he said that there were multiple reasons why the behavioral change in the Muslim Brotherhood. The first was the Brotherhood's pragmatism, which was related to the multiplicity of interpretations. The second was related to the businessman elite, which started to emerge within the Muslim Brotherhood with the opening or liberalization under Sadat in the 70s. And the third was related to seeking international recognition, which favors neoliberal policies. There were many questions as well in relation to political policies and the Nahda project, which was a hastened, incomplete reaction to the emergency situation at the time. There were other reasons he mentioned Yes. Here he mentioned 4 reasons. First was the political da'wah from a position of opposition rather than a political party. I believe this is something we elaborated on in our previous paper as well. Also, the lack of a comprehensive political project, because the objective of the Muslim Brotherhood was not to reach power as much as to effect political change, i.e., to practice politics from the position of the opposition rather than power. And he gave an example on the economic theory of the transformation from Islamic socialism to open market policies, and that was implemented or imposed by businessmen who affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. He also mentioned other examples. There was also a history of deferred internal disagreements where the movement tried to defer answering critical questions to maintain a cohesion of the movement. So they had diverse positions from economics and other issues, such as what he mentioned from Al-Adala wa Tanmiya project, the party, the Justice and the Freedom Party, and other businessmen affiliated with the same movement. So they avoided those critical answers in order to maintain cohesion. The third reason was the overlap of leadership. This was important because he talked about a structural rather than a personal conflict between Muhammad Morsi and Khairat al-Shatir, who was the strong man in the Muslim Brotherhood, and that the power relations would have necessitated that the strongest man in the movement should have run for presidency, but the president was also keen on networking and appeasing other political partners, and this was one of the reasons for failure. The fourth was who decides the fate of the movement after 2011 and 13, and that the disagreement was on a political disagreements were not handled well, and those disagreements became a dispute over who steers the direction for the movement. That between 2014 and 2015, it was that year in which all disagreements came to the surface and effectively killed the movement. His conclusion was that political roles of the Muslim Brotherhood is part of history now and shall not be part of the future, and what the movement can do at most is to reconcile with the regime and pledge never to be involved in political life again. And he believes that this is due to internal factors within the Muslim Brotherhood movement, particularly the lack of political vision or project. So this movement may continue in charity, social, and dawah terms, but it will not continue in political terms. And then he talked about a move from grand questions to detailed, smaller questions, which reflect as well much discrepancy and disagreement within the ranks of the movement in those answers. And also he mentioned that there are many people from within the Muslim Brotherhood who hold very diverse points of view, from the far right to the far left, and that they might have some political future of their own. Thank you so much for your papers. We start now with the commentators. Mr. Rida Fahmi, please go ahead.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First, I would like to point out something important, which is there is disengagement since 2016 and until now between me and the Muslim Brotherhood. So in this intervention, I express my own beliefs and my own ideas. I will start with the important paper that was presented by Dr. Abdul Rahman, 368 days in power. First, I have a general comment. His voice is very far away from the microphone. We can't hear him. Or what Dr. Abdul Wahab al-Masiri mentioned, called the inevitable bias. And I will quote this sentence by Abdul Wahab al-Masiri. He says that the inevitable bias and its inevitability comes because it is linked with the human mental, because the human mind is not a white page that gets everything. It's like a camera, or like a photographic camera. Actually, the human mind is active, creative, and free, which gets to the reality through a certain dialogue, which has some of the details that requires or similar to what is remaining. So this is coming from the main the main aspect of humanity. So what is everything that is a human is biased by nature. I believe that we are seeing some of the points that we can call the inevitable bias, as I said. So the first paper wanted to answer the question: how can a political group within or after this revolution can rule? The paper focused in part of it that the the revolutionary moment wanted to get to restore the health of the state, uh, and it allied with the judiciary and the security. I believe this is a theoretical and oversimplification aspect. Who would allow you in a way of people who are trying to fail you at the three levels: international, local, and regional level? I believe that this revolutionist moment requires that you put the authority in the state under control. This is what you need, and to eliminate all the aspects of a risk there, and to put or to take control over everything, because when you have control you can do everything that you need, and this will help you for the comprehensive will help you on the comprehensive reform. Anything else will be a waste. So you would either do that, or you will stay about that. Any idea that doesn't address eliminating the deepest state is something that is useless, and it will not be used. It will not be useful at that time. So in the first 72 hours, you have to take control over everything. This is the golden hour, and afterwards things will be this will be complicated. This is the history of revolutions that wanted to or achieved their goals. As for the first title, which is being aware of the historic moment, the researchers said that the Muslim Brotherhood, through their alliance with the military establishment, they wanted to be alliance with the or in alliance with the deepest states, and they wanted to make that gain for their interest. I believe that the Muslim Brotherhoods were made a grave mistake, because they were unable to put or tame the deep state. this is one of their weaknesses. And from here, I can say for sure that the Muslim Brotherhood didn't want to make alliance with the military establishment, but they wanted to bring them back, and this is different. And this shows the an unprecedented level of oversimplification and naivety within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood in dealing with this matter. The third point, which was, or the third lesson, which was the learning about reality and avoiding the misconceptions or the illusions. And he said that, or he suggests that the military leadership wants to maintain the leadership and the powers and the gains of the military establishment without running the country, and that will be enough or sufficient to make a uh, sustainable agreement with the military without foiling the Muslim Brotherhood. And here I would like to focus on one point, that at the time that the Muslim Brotherhood wanted to accommodate the military establishment without having any tools or skills to do that, the military establishment wanted to burn the Muslim Brotherhood and bring them out of the political life without coming back. And they have succeeded in that in a very strong way. If you want to play with your adversary just like a chess, you have to expect their moves and to play strategically with them. But if or showing that or um, setting traps for them and making it that you are unaware of this strategy while you are trapping them, and that's what the military establishment did with the Muslim Brotherhood. By time the Muslim Brotherhood proved that they lost their military, and they went into a strategy which is avoided confrontation with the army. First, because they wanted to see if they are able to get into such confrontation, and second, because they because they didn't want to be seen that they were wanted power alone without anybody else.
In addition to the third issue was the correction of mistakes. According to the presenter, the Muslim Brotherhood failed to address their disagreements with the others, particularly the seculars, and they had more trouble, particularly after the constitutional declaration by Muhammad Morsi in 2012, which was the beginning of the end for the Muslim Brotherhood. The paper used the anti-revolution discourse and considered the constitutional declaration by Muhammad Morsi a mistake, a grave mistake, because Muhammad Morsi gave himself absolute power, although the military institution over 2 years gave itself unsurmountable powers. In addition, or while this step was welcomed in general terms from the people, it was opposed by some revolutionary powers in favor of the military. In terms of his point on respecting previous pledges, that I agree with what the scholar mentioned, but also when he talked about going into something that's beyond their power, and he talked about the presidency, and that it was a gross mistake because the legacy of power in Egypt was too demanding, and that it was a golden opportunity for the military institution to stumble this experience and to eliminate any revolutionary seeds that would call for genuine change, and also that the Muslim Brotherhood had no bureaucratic experience or inexperience in managing the state. So before, for all of their history until the election of Morsi, they were in the position of opposition. I will try to address those 2 points objectively. For example, the decision to go into the presidential elections, regardless of whether this decision was mistaken or was taken in a wrong approach. And I would acknowledge that. I believe that the Brotherhood in Tunisia learned the lesson from the experience in Egypt, and they refrained from power, and they very carefully have the outcome been different. So the third world, all political actors in the third world suffer from this problem, which is the lack of bureaucratic experience. What's the solution? How can opposition acquire any skills if they cannot get close to the palaces of the republics? If we consider this a prerequisite for power circulation, then there is no power circulation. There would never be power circulation. The other issue in relation to building a comprehensive and sustainable political base, and it's important to acknowledge that the Muslim Brotherhood have the state at the center of their thoughts. So although they were antagonists to the state, their model of thought was state-centered rather than community-centered. So I believe this researcher was stood out quite much in tackling this point, and I would like to shed more light on this. I believe that the Muslim Brotherhood tried hard to be involved in the political process based on conception that Egypt was a very centralized state and that the president's position was the most important, and that was so much correct, because in the old regime, because the president would come from within the system and apply the same rules and respect them and uphold them, while Mohamed Morsi was from outside the system. And by the system, I'm talking about the institutions, the security institution, the judiciary, the media, the businessmen, Al-Azhar, the church, all of the institutions within the traditional system. All of those institutions were now under the power of the Muslim Brotherhood, while their the view of them was that at best they were good people who should collect zakat in mosques. So you also suggested that they gave priority to the survival of the movement at the expense of the revolution. Although the Brotherhood was forced to go into the revolution, but it tried to reap its fruit. You also talked about the Al-Ikhwan, or the Muslim Brotherhood, and the youth coalition. I'm not sure I noticed much light shed on this issue. I believe one of the most important mistakes done by Muslim Brotherhood was to fail their own young members in the coalition of young people, and trying to deform them and exclude them and then dismiss them from the membership. I believe that the history of the Muslim Brotherhood was full of such transgressions, such as what they did with Al-Arian, Al-Baltaji, and others, and with some departments and some committees affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, including the Palestine Committee. So all of this was a precedence of, or a model for success that was elitist and away from the leadership. Actually, we can very safely say that the movement had antagonized mostly its own children, its own affiliates, more than anyone else. I'm done with my feedback on the first paper, but I have taken probably more of my time. I will, when we talk about the other paper about ascending to the abyss by Mr. Ahmed Mohsen, let me give a very short story to summarize the point made by Mr. Ahmed Mohsen in Al-Mahkoum prison in 2007. In one of the instances, I was arrested and detained there was a discussion about the possibility of the Muslim Brotherhood ascending to power. This was in 2007 in Al Mahkoum prison. It was a discussion between an elite of leaders from the Muslim Brotherhood, and the majority thought that there was no probability for that. It's not likely, and that most of them, this is part of laghu, or not good talk, that we should not be involved with, and that even if they are offered power, they will turn it down, and they are not looking for power. And the question was, what if in some force majeure or emergency situation, the power comes to the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly that if the regime fails the people, a large segment of the Egyptian people believe that Muslim Brotherhood are the only people who are qualified for this position. Do we, in this case, have a political project? Everybody was silent. No one was able to answer that question. Do we have any plan or any scenario if this, or do we have any qualified cadres if this ever happens? And the answer was an enthusiastic yes. Do we have regional and international support? And so we conclude that there was a widespread view held within the Muslim Brotherhood, believing that reaching power in Egypt should not be part of our vision. So lack of, or absence of a political project was natural. So talking about, let alone speaking of regional or international backing, which was a luxury at the time. And this becomes particularly important when we look at the real experience, when the lack of regional and international backing was one of the most important points of failure. One of the ironies was that in Egypt, we cooperated with our brethren in Gaza in putting together a political project or plan to run that small region, particularly with the lack of national unity, with the rejection of the Fatah movement in order to fail Hamas movement. On the other hand, the Muslim Brotherhood did not pay attention that the Hamas also came to power by force rather than by choice. So they never saw that this probability should be taken into consideration and a scenario that is likely to happen. So this was a natural, gradual and ascent to have a political project, or conceptualization was only normal and a prerequisite. However, unfortunately, the issue of taking power was referred to in the literature, but it was absent in real terms, as Ahmed Mohsen mentioned. So this affected their political management. They tried to link between the ideas in their papers and the actual institutions in the ground. Why wasn't the movement able to interact with the facts on the ground adequately? Of course, they did not go. They did not use it to go into elections in order to to gain power or to take power, but for dawah purposes. But then it was only politics, and dawah was absent. So the Muslim Brotherhood was more concerned with its organizational structure than its actual content. There was a political department, but as a formative gesture, it was suspicious regarding any political tone, and it tried to marginalize any figures who would seem politically informed. Dr. Kamal Hishmat, Biltaji, Abu al-Futuh, all of those people were regarded with a little suspicion because of their political inclinations. All political decisions were deliberated and decisions were made within the leadership office or Irshad office, and these are decisions are reported to the offices and sections and the Brotherhood families, subsections. Mr. Ahmed also mentioned that there was a deferral for the of disagreements. I believe I disagree with you. Actually, the Muslim Brotherhood never tried to defer those disagreements. This organizational structure was an alternative to a deliberation and discussion. Actually, the Muslim Brotherhood never deferred or delayed those disagreements, but it decided on them or resolved them through dismissal or taking a final decision or etc. So the Muslim Brotherhood dealt with more violence than the state itself, sometimes with its opponents, while the state would use economic sanctions or penalties. This was understood from the state, while the conduct of the Muslim Brotherhood was unacceptable in that context. I also agree with what Mr. Khalil mentioned in terms of the economic reasons for the change of economic perspectives of the Muslim Brotherhood and the emergence of the businessman elite and the many questions he posed, but time does not accommodate for the details here. The third was in relation to seeking whether the Muslim Brotherhood mentality would go as far as to think of international recognition. So I give them the benefit of the doubt of those who ran policies within the Muslim Brotherhood. In terms of the overlapping in leadership, I believe it was the wrong man in the wrong place. We all know, for example, Dr. Isam al-Aryan, as the late Isam al-Aryan, may he rest in peace. He was a sort of the bridge from the various points of view to the Muslim Brotherhood. There were very strange things that would take place. So Dr. Isam was sort of domesticated and he became part of the organization, and the Muhammad Mursi, who was a man of the organization, became the president and the spearhead of the politics. Why wasn't he part of this play in the beginning? I believe that both Khairat and Muhammad Mursi were both part of the organization, so they were not politicians. So we cannot say that they. Mr. Muhammad Mursi was not a politician in the first place, but even in formative terms, it was very normal if you have a political party, as is the norm all over the world, that the head of that party would be the president-elect or the nominee for presidency rather than the person from the file and rank. The Muslim Brotherhood fears a change in organizational terms, and what happened in 2014 and 2015 that shed doubt on this strategy was proof of that, and also opponents were concerned about the new plan, not in terms of content. And I have many actually examples in this context that the Muslim Brotherhood panic from the idea of change itself. They look at it as a threat to the organization and its stabilization and its stability and its establishment and persistence. So they prefer the status quo, basically, because out of fear from the unknown that may emerge from this change. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Rida, for this elaborate comments on both papers. Now our second commentator, Mr. Muhammad Ilhami.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you in the name of God, and the prayers and the blessings upon his messenger. I would like to thank Dr. Sami and Sigi and the Egyptian Institute and other organizers and partners. I believe that this is one of the rare moments, or maybe the only moment, I find myself a commentator in the defense position, and usually I try to be in the attack position. We all want to defend. Of course, because Dr. Isam was the head of the Egypt Institute. I'm still is. Yeah, of course, you are still the head of the institute. Anyway, these two papers were written by my dear friends, Dr. Abdurrahman and Ahmed, and both I have good relations and old relations with both of them. But I believe that these two papers paid injustice to the group. I would like to differentiate between two issues. First of all, when we are evaluating the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in governance as an Egyptian experience, and when I distinguish or evaluate their internal work of the Muslim Brotherhood, this is a different point. Now, if we speak about the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood as a prospect, I believe the best way to do that is the psychology of the oppressed, and not the political perspective. The political perspective to control over the two papers. And if we read these two papers without taking into consideration the circumstances that took place in Egypt, we believe that the Muslim Brotherhoods were removed in the next elections, and not by a military coup. And this military coup was a military security power that used force. I would accept everything in these two papers if they fell in the coming elections, where for example, they have double standards in leadership. They couldn't gain the trust of the governed people. They don't have a clarity in the political theory. All of that can be effective if the fail of the Muslim Brotherhood was normal through elections. But because this fail was by a armed military coup, then the perspective of and analyzing the failure should be different. Of course, I don't challenge some of the points that were mentioned. I don't accept them all, but I don't challenge them all. But the failure of the governance, then no, these factors that were mentioned are not influential, in my opinion. Even the double standards or the having double leadership between Khairat al-Shatar and Mohammed Morsi, and having a group or an organization, this wasn't effective on the political context. Therefore, and there were no breaks between Mohammed Morsi and Mohammed Khairat al-Shatar, leading to the failure of the experience. Because or if they don't have a clear vision, and Dr. Ahmed Mohsen and Dr. Hussam also mentioned that if they don't have a complete, integrated, clear project, not a single revolution has that project before it is launched. But I would claim that the Muslim Brotherhood tried to establish a political party in 2007. They had a political committee, and they had some of the some cadres who were political in the universities. So I believe the Nahda project that was defamed a lot. I believe that it has strong pillars for an Islamic experience. Once again, I would go back to say that these two papers, the main disadvantage of them, that they were talking about the failure, the toppling the Muslim Brotherhoods as if it was in natural elections, whereas their failure or the military coup that was made was completely disregarded in these two papers. And there are some Muslim Brotherhoods that didn't have this available for them, including Iraq, Yemen, Tunisia, and all of these experiences led or had a similar fate, just like the one that happened in Egypt, although they didn't get to governance. Dr. Sami, when my time is over, please stop me because I don't know when to stop. I will stop when you tell me to stop. So I will start with one detailed comment on the paper of Dr. Abdulrahman. I agree with him, and this is also a rare agreement with his paper, that when he said that the Muslim Brotherhood, although I disagree with him with the consequence and the result, but that I agree with him that the Muslim Brotherhood uh, uh, watered down their ideology, which meant that their positions were not clear, and we didn't know what's the meaning of a political Islam that they were talking about. So this is correct. But the movement that loses its identity, it loses its purpose or raison d'être, and there are clear lines between the revolutionists and the reformists, between the theory of society and theory of governance, and the leftist and the liberal, and these are something that is clear. So this is one of the structural problems that was before the January Revolution. That's why I said that we need to analyze them by the psychology of the oppressed. So when we're talking about a group that is looking for itself existence in a political environment that rejects them, this was the trap that they got into. The establishment and the presence of the Muslim Brotherhood was a message or a mission of a change in this reality, but then they tried to accommodate this reality. So by doing this, it loses its clarity in discourse and its strength points. So that's why there was some political confusion in its positions. One of the methodological also comments, I don't want to focus on. Both papers depended on Western researchers or foreign researchers, in something whose main witnesses are present, and with the differences in the two papers, or the idea of getting out of bias. But even the Western researcher, when they research our issues, they can't get to the core reality of issues as they are stated by the people who are living in our communities, because there are cultural differences, and this is the worst thing. Other than the difference, cultural differences, there is selectiveness in the research and analysis. At the end of the day, this researcher is either an Arabist who knows Arabic, or he doesn't know Arabic. If he doesn't know Arabic, then he only talked with people who speak English. The revolution young people who were in tens or hundreds of thousands or millions, so who are in the squares, a limited number of them who speak English. So if they interviewed only those people, so this is not a representative sample, but if they speak Arabic, then they will not be able to get out of the elites that are presented in newspapers and on TVs, because their knowledge of our society cannot go beyond those elites. And our media outlets in our countries, whether in their structure that are affiliated with the state or under the control of the businessmen who created them, they focused on uh, showing a specific a part of those elites. So Mr. Hussam, in his words, he was commending the the youth, the Revolution Youth Coalition, although didn't have any effect, not even in the revolution of the 25th of the 25th January revolution. And I'm talking about that as an eyewitness, not things from the TV. And I'm not undermining their effort, but to put the Revolution Youth Alliance that was established in uh, at the maximum 6 years before the revolution, and compare them with the Muslim Brotherhood, who are well rooted in the community in for 80 or 90 years ago, and make that comparison, this is not fair. And the Revolution Youth Alliance wasn't influential at all. And some of those people, they thought that they are leaders of the revolution, and they started to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood in contempt and disregard, and they didn't include them in their decisions, and they not even dealt with them in a peer manner. And if they accepted to them, they found themselves, and if the Muslim Brotherhood dealt with them, they found that, or they considered them because they are weak, and if they disregarded them, they considered that they are hegemonizing the revolution. So I believe if we evaluate the Muslim Brotherhoods from within, we will have a different evaluation. The Muslim Brotherhood said that we're not going to have a candidate for a presidency, and we don't want to get a majority in the parliament. Why? Because of the psychological of the psychology of the oppressed. They did that because they wanted the revolution to win. So what happened is that the Revolution Youth Alliance, under some of the cartoon leadership like Muhammad al-Baradei and others who came back to Egypt after their retirement, so they wanted to have the elections through the list system, because that is the system. So the Muslim Brotherhood needed to be present in all, or to vote for all the seats. If we had, for example, the elections, the parliamentary elections, according to the individual numbers, so we can you can hold them accountable for voting, for example, for more than the third. So when they selected the list uh, electoral system, then they had to make sure that they will have seats in the parliament, because those who don't want the Muslim Brotherhood and they want to have religious, so they voted for the Salafists. They said we are not going to have a presidential candidate. That's a promise, but they worked until they found two options. They will be either in the palace or in the grave. So they won in the parliamentary, and they had a majority, and they were unable to remove Al Janzuri, the prime minister. And in the establishment of the cabinet, the military council said that I'm going to take the 10 sovereign ministries, and you take the rest of them. So that's why the candidacy of the president was inevitable, especially that those who were running for presidency were Omar Suleiman and Mohammed Shafiq, and both were having promises to eliminate the revolution. So we can't say that when the Muslim Brotherhood voted or had a presidential candidate and they wanted to go to the presidency, they didn't meet their promises, then this is not just. Of course, I stayed for 10 years with the Muslim Brotherhood from 1996 to 2006. I left them before the revolution, way before the revolution. So you graduated from the revolution. I left them before the revolution, 5 years before the revolution erupted. So one of the points that we need to focus on very quickly in the paper of the Dr. Abdul Rahman, he said that the Muslim Brotherhood were unable to build a project, a joint project, and to bring those who are different from them. And he called this opportunistic approach. I reject the word opportunistic here, and this is not to defend them. They have some opportunistic approach internally, but the Muslim Brotherhood, and under the analysis of the oppressed psychology, and this is something that I'm focusing on for the Muslim Brotherhood. The revolution was very shaking event. This revolution, they felt or one of their concerns that it will be against them, just like the what happened in 1954. That's why they fiercely wanted to continue to the elections and to continue the democratic path for their interest, for the interest of the people or the state or the public. I don't know. This is something that we can discuss, but everything that would uh, uh, threaten the continuation of the revolution and the parliament and things that they stopped against it. For example, the military council said that we want uh, stability. That's why we don't want elections. So they would say we want stabilities. That's why we will do elections. For example, the events of Muhammad Mahmoud Square would be against the Muslim Brotherhood, so they didn't want to have that. So did they initiated the candidacy of a president? No, they wanted Muhammad Bishri or Al Ghariani or others to be candidates, but they rejected. Did they try to take control of the cabinet? No, they tried to bring people from the Revolution Youth Alliance, but they rejected. So they wanted to put the Muslim Brotherhood in a place to hold them accountable, including Wael Ghanem and others. I'm not going to mention all of the names. So the Muslim Brotherhood were keen to continue the constitutional or to complete the constitutional steps. With this keenness, they also they reached the level of abandoning their principles. Why? Because they wanted to reach the moment of safety, because they didn't want to have a military coup. But the only time the military coup happened when Abdel Fattah al-Sisi with his reassuring face came into I wish the Muslim Brotherhood were afraid from the military council even during a Sisi, but they were not, because a Sisi made them numb and reassured them until they faced the military coup as a reality in their face. But they even went beyond the constitutional declaration. For example, the issue of the referendum of the 15th of March was that an escape by the Muslim Brotherhood in order to control the country? No, not at all. I would also say that the only mistake that the military council that made was to have a fair committee to make these amendments, and this committee was really diversified, and the military personnel had a mature mind. And Mr. Abdullah al-Bishri is not an Islamist, and he has some Nasri inclination, and there was the also Christians, and there were others. And there were some people from Al Wafd. There were liberals as well, and the liberalism is from Al Wafd party as well. So these amendments that were written by this committee were very professional, which included the legal jurisprudence and the political vision, which means which said that the power should be handed over to civilians. So they said that the parliamentary elections should start first, and then we will have a constituent assembly, which will write the constitution, and then it will lead to the presidential elections, and that so the president doesn't affect the work of the constituent assembly. So it is not possible to someone to say that the committee didn't represent a lot of popular grassroots, and it led to a break in the community. No, this is unfair. The committee was elected by an fairly elected parliament, and then the Islamic group left their share from the constitutional drafting group. They abandoned their seats, whereas none of the secular groups abandoned any of their gains. And here I also read something that the Muslim Brotherhood communicated or made alliance made alliance with the Salafists against the secular. This is not correct at all. Okay, I will calm down because it seems that the equipment here are against what I'm saying. So when we look deeper, we can see that the Muslim Brotherhood escaped making alliance with the Islamists to the alliance with the secular people, and Hamdin Sabahi and others, they won on the lists of the Muslim Brotherhood in the parliament, and the Muslim Brotherhood didn't want to make alliance with the Salafists and the Islamic movement, which made the latter to make the Islamic alliance. So now I will move to the next paper, or the second paper. Maybe I talked about the second paper in some parts of my comments. Dr. Ahmed Mohsen is a dear brother, and we have a lot of lengthy discussions between each other. I mentioned the points on relying on Western research papers. I will suffice with one point or one key point here in the paper of Dr. Ahmed, which he mentioned that the Muslim Brotherhood had postponed questions and things that were not answered. These postponed questions led to the political confusion when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power and then after the coup. And at the end, he said, or in conclusion, he said that these other answers, even if they, or these other questions, even if they were answered, the Muslim Brotherhood will lose a large sector of their members. If we reach this conviction and that the devil lies in the details, I believe that it would have been wise to postpone these differences. This is not a mistake. Even in if any institution they are going to solve their or even a family want to solve all of their problems together, they will get out with everyone with their differences, and the wife and the husband, if we are talking about a family, will divorce. So it's not a problem not to solve all the questions or to postpone some questions. So why do we talk about things that might cause uh, a division in the group, and we talk about things that are not proposed in the reality, and to say I didn't know any revolution in history that was completely prepared before it happened. And even if when we read, for example, in the history of the Prophet, when he traveled from Mecca to Medina, the only thing that he had was the unity of God and the prayers. But in terms of the relation with non-Muslims, women rights, and communicating with the other political powers, all of these things were revealed in Medina after the establishment of the state. So postponing differences and not to discuss things that were not proposed in the first place, I believe this is out of wisdom, and it can help sometimes, and because the answer to these questions sometimes might be problematic at the time. And there are the political science departments in several universities. They talk about mature visions of the Islamic groups. If we don't have mature visions, then we are going to get into problems. And when we talk about Al-Masiri's vision or Al-Hallaq, etc., I believe these are some problematic matters will be. So with keeping the friendship with my two brothers, but I hope that that's why I spoke very openly and honestly here. Thank you, Mr. Muhammad. I would like to thank Mr. Muhammad Ilhami. There is a comment, I will read it, then I will give the space to any other comments. One of the written comments says that what has been said about the Vermont meeting is a historic
One of the
problem
written
because it
comments
came
was
after
that
the
what you
second
said
round
about
after
the
everybody
Vermont
voted.
was a historical mistake.
Any comments before we give the space? to the speakers.
Any comment before we give the floor to the speakers to respond? Dr. Amr, please go ahead. To complete what Dr. Rida has just mentioned, he said he belonged to the, or affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood for some time. I never affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, but to talk about the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood joined the revolution only after the fact, as though we are referring to a revolution that started in January 2011 or the 25th of January. The revolution has been there for historically for a long time. So from the 60s, from all the movements that the Muslim Brotherhood was involved in. The other point, the much pressure on the other organizations to sort of restrict them. And they are already in a sort of a siege and of much pressure and security, crackdown in external and internal and foreign restrictions. And so it's impossible for organizations working in those conditions to be completely open and completely declared, completely transparent and completely democratic. So those demands are illogical given the conditions in which they were operating. The other point in relation to the constitutional declaration, I believe this was one of the greatest gestures by Dr. Mohamed Morsi, because all the time he was trying to win the political battles, and actually they won all political battles with the military up to the presidential elections, and they forced the army, because the army could have succeeded in democratic tools and they would have claimed legitimacy. So this should be acknowledged, this success, and the army was forced to use the military power and violently, and I believe that is only a proof to the win that the Muslim Brotherhood has won. We always talk about things from a monodimensional point of view. For example, the idea of partnership in democracy. There is no such a thing in democracy. You win, you get your party. You're not always required to have a coalition with other parties. This is only specific to transitional periods, and that's different from a revolution. The revolution is a radical change. So this overlap of concepts blurs our vision and our judgment. Thank you, Dr. Amr. Dr. Leila, please go ahead. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, peace and blessings be on Prophet Muhammad. Thanks for all the papers and comments. To carry on what we were discussing in the previous session and the overlap and similarities between the Sudanese experience and the Egyptian experience, and this problem between the political and the organizational, who would be the president, the community versus the state, and this agreement was between Sheikh Hassan, who was the main intellectual and the founder of the movement, versus Omar al-Bashir, the military figure who ascended to power. And that was the reason for the fissure in the lines of the Islamic movement in Sudan, because al-Bashir is an Islamic figure from the ranks of the military, and that is not the same with the Egyptian experience. Another issue that drove my attention in Egypt was calling for non-violence and peacefulness in the revolution, particularly by the leaders, while people were faced with violence. I believe there are certain concepts that we need to agree upon across all Islamic movements in terms of revolution, peacefulness and non-violence, self-defense, etc. Also, another point in relation to the experience of Islamic rule has it Islamized governance, although it was short-lived in Egypt, but in Sudan we have 30 years of governance. So after 30 years of power, we still have secular people who came from an Islamic background. What I wanted to mention was that Sheikh Hassan, the late Hassan al-Turabi, went to Egypt in order to try to take stock of what was going on in Egypt at the time and to provide advice on different levels. The first was in terms of the antagonism of the US and Israel and the West in general against the Islamic movement in Sudan, and also the opposition of the Islamic movement, as well as the experience of the Sudanese political parties in the opposition and how they tried to fail and outthrow the Islamic movement. And the fourth factor he wanted to discuss with the Muslim Brotherhood was the in-house fissure between the ranks of the Islamic movement, between the political and the military, etc. And what we learned was that he advised the Muslim Brotherhood to only try to win the elections in the parliament and not seek presidency, because it's going to be a very heavy undertaking and legacy, and you will be scrutinized by the Egyptian people, and you will fail, particularly that you have no presence in the military and the security, because the deep state over 60, 70 years has been dominated by the other party, and your experience did not allow you to infiltrate into those institutions, unlike our experience in Sudan. So this was the advice offered to the Muslim Brotherhood. They were advised not to seek power, not to seek the presidency, but to only work within the parliament and through other bodies until they build their capacities gradually 2 or 3 sessions later. And at the time, this advice was played down or rejected because of overconfidence. So it was not accepted. So when Sheikh Hassan returned, he knew that his advice was turned down. So I don't know if there was someone from the Islamic movement at the time who would tell us why that proposal or that advice was rejected, and how would you explain that? Thank you so much, Dr. Leila, Mr. Muhammad. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, I am very glad with this symposium, although this symposium has been very harsh and has been opening our old wounds, but it has been very informative, and we have to endure this in order to summarize the evaluation of the Muslim Brotherhood experience in governance. What I can say in their experience that their main mistake was that they allowed themselves to be failed. They had no reason to be resisted and to fail. They shouldn't have triggered such opposition to themselves. So I believe the main mistake was that. The other issue, I agree with Dr. Ilhani that revolutions come suddenly, and it's normal that we wouldn't be ready for them with political projects. Of course, even if they come by surprise, any political actor or a movement operating in the political arena should have an outline for different scenarios, or at least an outline of a vision. For example, I remember when I was a young man, if this Mubarak becomes Abdul Nasser, what would we do? this lack of clarity and preparedness on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood or the actors within those lines, they were unprepared for any emerging scenarios and leaving things just for time and developments as they emerge. This allowed for this sort of shaking in the performance of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time of the revolution. The third issue, from my point of view, which was not regarded or discussed by the scholars, was not using the momentum. The momentum of the time is the Trojan horse at any point, and the best person who used it was Sisi, actually. There is momentum. The most important momentum was when President Morsi dismissed the military council, and he should have used the week afterwards in taking radical steps in establishing the governance. And unfortunately, they did not see the day. And also, the other factors by the Muslim Brotherhood that caused their own failure was that their governance philosophy was the philosophy of governing with love. So actually, this is incorrect even at the level of a household. When you are a parent, you cannot only govern or run your own children only with love. And I'm not saying that you would use intimidation or not use the constitution, etc. Look at what Erdogan did here against a journalist who abused him, while Mohamed Morsi was accommodating for all critical views. So, and as an eyewitness, I believe Sisi did not fool the Muslim Brotherhood. He was clear from day one. He never mentioned the word president or the legitimacy or democracy, or he always said the people's will, the people's will, the people's will. But the Muslim Brotherhood depended on a deferral of black or dark scenarios, as anyone who lacks longer-term strategies. So Sisi did not fool the Muslim Brotherhood until the last day when he gave the 48-hour speech. They thought that the army on the ground stood for them rather than against them. So all he had to say was, "I'm going to do a coup d'etat against you in 48 hours." He would say it so bluntly. They thought they had the upper hand until the last moment, although he said it quite clearly. So anyone who understands the alphabet of conflict and power struggles would recognize that Sisi has always intended to rule Egypt from day one. Thank you so much, Shadi. There was a time in which I was detained with Mr. Hassan Abu Ismail, and I asked him, where did you bring that view or that ability to foresee the implications of certain actions? He said, or certain events, he said that what made me understand the developments is that I studied revolutions and counter-revolutions. It was like a catalog. It's not, I wasn't smart. Anybody who would study revolutions and counter-revolutions would understand how those things unravel. So what I'd like to say is that the Muslim Brotherhood movement in its political experience after the revolution made the gravest mistake, which is to legitimize the political role of the military council. It made it viable when it agreed for its presence in the transitional power and left it unchecked to govern the transitional period after the 18-month period, 18-day period. And the most important strength of the movement was the critical mass for political change, and this was the greatest stumbling block for the military council. They needed to dismantle that mass so that it doesn't stand against it in the streets. And the point that the Muslim Brotherhood failed to take advantage of was how to give that critical mass the flexibility to move on the ground and also have a political presence across from the military council. At the time of the events in Muhammad Mahmoud Square, when we were decided not to take part as students who affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, we decided that we will participate because one of our colleagues was shot there, and we were questioned as why we took part while we were instructed not to. We actually gathered more than 6,000 students who participated in that movement, and that gave us the weight and the image within the student unions or student movements that gave us immunity against the titles like cowards, etc., that was used for other branches of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. So in ethical and revolutionary terms, we measured our actions and we moved forward. And that's why things were different for us at the university. But the Muslim Brotherhood movement lacked the sensibility in reaching out for the people in public affairs and being context sensitive. I would like now to give the floor to our speakers. Can you give me a minute? Isam Abdul Shafi. Yes, Dr. Isam, please go ahead. Peace be upon you all. Thank you so much, first of all, Dr. Sami, and I thank all the organizers for this important conference. And we're also in the Egyptian Studies Center happy to take part in the organization of this conference or this event, because this evaluation is important, particularly that over the past 10 years, we experienced many movements and many bodies and Islamic ascents in most Arab countries, since most of those elites have now come to Turkey, and with the presence of other elites from Morocco, Sudan, Libya, and Yemen, there is much interaction between those experiences and the experience in Turkey. And this is very important. It requires not only this conference, but it's a very important and positive point of start. I was honored to cooperate with Dr. Sami in preparation for this symposium, particularly this one concerned with the Egyptian case. I followed the work, your session yesterday, and I thank Yumna for coordinating my work yesterday through YouTube, and I followed you on YouTube and on Zoom, and today I followed you on Zoom, and I listened to most of the papers, and I believe that, thank God, I have very good relations with most of the attendees and the young people involved, Mr. Ahmed Ilhami, Shadi, Muhammad Abbas, Amr Adel, and of course, Dr. Sami Al-Ariyan. But I believe that a large number of the papers presented have a lot of bias, and this bias sometimes come even in the title before we reach the conclusions based on indicators and on a scientific methodology. Although I have taken a look at the paper of Ahmed Mohsen previously and discussed some of the ideas with him previously and some remarks and feedback on the methodology, and he is quite outstanding in his discipline and his specialization, but always in the humanities, we need to have reserve on any determinate or absolute conclusions, because those are not really viable in political sciences and social sciences. So the conclusive statement at the end of his presentation to say that the Muslim Brotherhood was part of history rather than and shall not be part of the future of Egypt, and that it's unlikely to have any political power in the future, that's quite deterministic. So if we assume that the regime falls today, I don't think that would hold true. So because we as scholars in political science, we deal with theories, concepts, and ideas, and if we base our work on a certain concept and on a certain conceptualization, we will, and you use a different conceptualization, you will reach different outcomes. Some papers have also some sort of perception of wishing, some a sort of a biased view, and all of these are biased because we need to be practical and objective in our approach, and because at the end of the day we are all specialists in political sciences and social sciences, so we need to be really clear about terminology and about our perspectives. So from my point of view, we needed to be more precise in our approach. I also liked a lot the term used by Ilhami, the psychology of the oppressed. This is the first time I hear this term. After I heard it, I looked it up and I searched for it, and I found it as an important point of reference, that it involves a lot of points that are necessary for the analysis of a social phenomenon and phenomena of static or conservative references in the political arena. The other point was to refer to the Muslim Brotherhood and whether they failed themselves or were failed. I am sort of reserved about this approach to talk about the failure of policies. The failure has its own reasons, its own justifications, and its own context. But what we are saying right now, what we are concerned with right now, from my point of view, is to ask how a reformist movement worked in a revolutionary context. Did it have the tools? If it had the tools, was it consistent with its own capacities and the nature of the environment? Did the environment or the context provide it with opportunities or threats that the Muslim Brotherhood was able to deal with them actively, or was it passive? This is on the one hand. On the other hand, what you mentioned, also what Dr. Leila mentioned in relation to Dr. Hassan al-Turabi, I heard this before from Dr. Hassan al-Turabi, and that in a university in Sudan, and he mentioned that he personally, along with other leaders, went to Egypt and talked with the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, and there was lack of seriousness, and people were not even keen on listening to the advice by Hassan al-Turabi. At the end of the day, although this was quite important, but it's marginal in the context of all the challenges that the Muslim Brotherhood faced over a span of a single year. So the military coup which happened in 2013 would have taken place, even if it was Mohammed Sabahi or anyone else who was the president of Egypt. At the end of the day, we're talking about a military institution, and I am specialized in military civilian relations. It is a military institution that is infiltrating, powerful, far-reaching, and that has international relations that make it capable of threatening any political regime. And all the intellectuals who talk about this empire that no longer deal with the state as part as there's an army being affiliate with the state, but as an army having a state. Over the past 5 days, actually, if with the anniversary of the 25th of January of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi issued grants and gifts by giving the army power over acres of lands and giving away things as though they are his own. So this military institution has an omnipotent sort of power, not only in terms of its infiltration within Egypt, but also with its international alliances. So it is unfair to compare the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood over a year in Egypt with that of in Turkey between 2002 and 2022, and or An-Nahda in Tunisia. At the end of the day, ever since day one, there was systematic targeting of the Muslim Brotherhood to overthrow it. Of course, there were mistakes that are undeniable at all levels by representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood in the government, in the parliament, or in the different institutions, or in their management of their internal political alliances. But at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that there were antagonists and rivals who should not only be regarded as rivals, but as an army. The Muslim Brotherhood had to face an army backed by an international and regional backers that are quite powerful and wanted to maintain the status quo, not only for in Egyptian terms, but in regional terms as well. So this overstatement or exaggeration in talking about what the Muslim Brotherhood had and how they wasted, I believe, much of that criticism addressed to the Muslim Brotherhood is because all of us, whether we affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood or not, we regarded it as a solid mass or the greatest, most powerful body that had all the capacities to manage states, not only a single state, and that they had much capability. So many of the criticisms was based on the view by many analysts and critics to the capacities that this movement had and did not employ properly at such an important historical juncture. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Isam, for this comment. And Dr. Isam actually has a paper to present tomorrow about the Muslim Brotherhood and how it governed or managed its regional and international relations. Now we are going to give the chance for the speakers to respond a few minutes each. Okay. Let me start with something that Dr. Saif used to tell us when we talked about the conspiracy theory. He told us there was something of a conspiracy on one's self. This is one important introduction. The question on how can the Muslim Brotherhood not have any tools and cadres. There was this joke that someone went to the shop, and they asked for halawa, and they said they didn't have, although they had inside. This is what happened with the Muslim Brotherhood. They said they didn't have capabilities, but they did have qualified people. So there are many things I wanted to comment on Ilhami in terms of governance. If you notice, the idea of governance had quote unquote in the title, meaning that they actually didn't rule or govern. So they were in power, but did not have the actual power or authority on the ground. And I believe that you would agree with my conclusion. In terms of the Islamic experience you are referring to, man, they brought the person who wrote the policies of the movement to write up the I can't remember the exact name, but he was a person who drafted also the principles of the Justice and Freedom Party. As for the sources, I only did not refer to them because of lack of time. But in the second part of my paper, I have different interviews and they are still ongoing. As for Sisi and how he fooled the Muslim Brotherhood and the warnings against the coup d'etat, I believe those are endless stories. Each one of us have heard many, and this comes in the context of the conspiracy against oneself. Who is responsible for this? Only the Muslim Brotherhood, in my opinion. Dr. Rida also mentioned something very important, which is the elimination of the figures of the old regime, and I totally agree. After the revolution, we used to joke with our friends, say we have a list of 500 to 1,000 people to be held to fair trial and be executed. This was the talk of young people, but I don't believe it was taken seriously by the leaders. Actually, there were some central issues here. First of all, being away from the street and not using the revolution against the military and accept the hegemony of the military was a grave mistake. And we're always told at any decisive moment that they were forced to do this, and that unless they did that, the coup d'etat would have been inevitable. So, Dr. Isam, you say that I am being deterministic in talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, but you also talked about in deterministic terms about the military coup, and I don't believe it was inevitable. So those mistakes and this idea of working by necessity created a background or a mentality of justification, trying to say that you act in a certain way because you were forced to do so or out of necessity. It was the Muslim Brotherhood who themselves put themselves in the corner and then said that they were forced to do so and so. The other point in relation to the inevitability of running for presidency, the obsession with the 45% majority was always persistent with the Muslim Brotherhood, but the obsession of 1954 was persistent with the Muslim Brotherhood, but surprisingly, the Muslim Brotherhood forgot about it in 2011 and were crushed by the military in the same manner. There are some details that I'm going to skip. As for the participation of the Muslim Brotherhood in the revolution, no, in the first place, they did not take part in they are not a revolutionary movement. I agree. You can tell me that they have always been a revolutionary movement. I said that they upheld the revolution. I don't disagree. After the 28th of January, the situation was different from before. But as for the siege of the organization itself, the movement itself was the reason for its own siege. The idea of conspiracy against oneself. The complementary constitutional declaration, I will not go into details, but I totally disagree with you. As for the young youth revolution youth coalition, I believe they played an important role in Tahrir Square and elsewhere, and after the revolution they became only dispersed individuals, but I believe that the coalition played an important role that is not to be played down or neglected. And in my presentation and in the time allowed, I was unable to talk about the second part of my paper, which is about the youth coalition, the revolutionary youth coalition, and the young people in the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood. I hope I will have a chance to discuss that second part at a later time. Thank you, Mr. Abdul Rahman. Now we give the floor to Mr. Ahmed Mohsen if he has any responses. Thank you, Doctor. Actually, let's start with what we have in common, which is the idea that when we talk about the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood between 2011 and 2013, we cannot neglect that it was overthrown when a coup d'etat, and that though it wasn't a natural exit through elections or etc., but it was in a coup d'etat. This is true, and since the beginning of my paper, I said that it wasn't only the military institution that failed the Muslim Brotherhood experience, but there was also a regional and international factor, as well as other parties, our elites away from the general interest and lack of nuance in terms of taking care that we're talking about a democratic transformation, a context that's totally different at any other time. But so those are not to be neglected. However, what my paper was trying to point out is that when we try to judge, not to judge, let me say to evaluate this experience, these are external factors that need to be taken into consideration in any political undertaking. And if we are to undertake evaluation, and I'll undertake evaluation in this case on an internal level, this evaluation should focus on the conduct of the movement itself and what it did and its actions. So our focus in this case on the internal dynamics becomes justified because it gives us a point of view on what happened in the past and what could happen differently in the future. So this may have been an important introduction for my responses, because I may disagree in a point or two, but I believe in those points there is a common understanding. This takes me to the other point where there may be a little disagreement with Mr. Muhammad Ilhami when he said that the reasons mentioned in the paper were important but non-influential in the political context. So actually, everybody would say that there are important influences and factors, but the presence or lack thereof of a political vision for the Muslim Brotherhood was a decisive factor. So what Mr. Rida mentioned at the beginning was very interesting. Did you deal with the military as an ally, a foe, a friend? This political vision that is the minimum standard for governance would have helped us avoid many of the losses. I wouldn't say that it would have 100% eliminated the possibility of a coup d'etat, but even if a military coup d'etat took place, it would have been less influential or less harmful had we have had a clear political vision and also a clear economic vision, what I would do with the military institution and with other institutions as well in economic terms. And this takes me to another question by Mr. Muhammad Abbas and your relation to the military council. I believe my paper said that the measures taken were incomplete because they were unclear. If we analyze that step, now we can find it not a strategic step, but a tactical one that does not fall within a strategic vision. So it was successful at the time. But if we had that vision, and even if we had one or two mistakes, but we had a comprehensive vision, this would have led to a better result. There is also the intervention by Dr. Leila on the pre-2011 situation, and that is one of the stories, the important stories, and it summarizes a lot of what I mentioned in my paper. When the movement nominated someone, it nominated someone who is from the ranks of the organization rather than the leader. So the powers given and who takes the leadership was blurred, was unclear. Another point that probably needs further consideration in the future was the movement deferring its differences, or was it putting them off or trying to address them one by one? And I believe if we look at the statements of Hassan Malik with the association that he established, and he brought some businessmen, some of whom were in the National Party, I believe that we would find certain similar conduct in post-2011, but they were not declared because there was what he said was organizational subjugation, that everybody would work within that ceiling or that umbrella. Even if we have diverse points of view, I will not declare them. It needs to run smoothly and more homogeneously. And I believe it was smart, since I was in a situation where I wasn't in power. I should have thought about those ideas and those issues that may have caused disagreement within the ranks of the organization or of the movement. So it would have been better probably not to discuss them in order to secure continuity. But with the moment of truth, the moment of political change, we have those questions and they needed answers. So you either had to take your time and look up your questions and look your answers and your approach to the economy, to the military council, how you're going to deal with each one of these things. And in that time, in 2011, you didn't have enough time or mechanisms or capacity to reach these answers, but you had all the opportunities since 2000, when you accessed the parliament with 17 members, and then in 2005 to start to create an outline for your vision to make use of them at the moment of change.
So these are just a few answers of some of the questions, and in the future, I believe the most important, as the paper said, to have a clear political vision amongst the political Egyptians in order to govern the way of their work. This is an important part, and it should be built, or it should be made through capacity building. When we build capacity to have a qualified people, and not to go through the mentality that if we are not in governance, so why do we need to do that? We need to build these capacities to have the minimum level of capacities and the qualifications and people who can run institutions or work in these institutions to interact politically. So I believe to having this capacity will be the key for the solution in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed Mohsen. And I would like to thank Mr. Abdulrahman Hussam. Today, we talked about in 2 sessions. We had deliberated 4 papers, and I believe they were important. The comments were important about them, and this discussion will continue, and it will not stop. Tomorrow, we also have 2 sessions. The 4th session will be about policies and performance with the Muslim Brotherhood and the economy. This is what Mr. Ahmed Mohsen talked about. Did the Muslim Brotherhood had a vision in economics? Mr. Abdul Haq Al-Sawi will speak about that, and he was one of the people who discussed that point at the time. And we will also have 2 other papers about the performance of the Muslim Brotherhood in the foreign relations and in the at the level of the region and at the level of the international region, and that will be at 8 Greenwich time, 11 Istanbul time. The second session will be at 3:30 Istanbul time, 12:30 Greenwich GMT, and it will be in English. And we will have also a discussion. We will have Dr. Hiba Ra'u, and it will be a panel with 4 participants. Dr. John Esposito, Dr. Al-Hashimi, and Dr. Abdullah Al-Aryan, and a 4th speaker. So hope to see you tomorrow to continue this interesting discussion, which will continue on the coming 2 days. Thank you very much for being with us, and peace be upon you all.